past midnight on the Great North Road, with the carriage lamps cutting pale arcs through the dark and the horses breathing hard into the cold. Isabel Ashcombe sat in her wedding dress and read. She was not weeping. She was not staring at the window with her hands folded in her lap, waiting for grief to arrive like a polite guest. She was reading a 40-page document by the light of a single lantern, a pencil moving steadily in her right hand, her left thumb marking the top corner of each page as she turned it. The dress was ivory silk, the cloak across her lap was wool, and the marriage settlement of the Duke and Duchess of Ashcombe had been placed on the seat beside her, before the carriage cleared the Ashcombe gates. Taken from her traveling case, unrolled, and opened at the first clause as though she had been waiting all evening to begin. The road north was black and uneven, the carriage rocking on its springs, and the lantern swayed on its hook above her head. Isabel did not look up. She marked and turned and marked again. Mr. Finch, her coachman, her own coachman, hired with her own money, housed at Marwood Hall, loyal to no one in the world but her, called down from the box as they passed the first milestone. "Your Grace, the next inn is 4 miles on. Shall I stop?" "Drive through, Mr. Finch," Isabel said, without raising her eyes from the page. "I am not tired. I am annotating." There was a pause from the box. "Very good, Your Grace," Mr. Finch said, and the horses did not slow. The settlement had been drafted by the Dowager Duchess of Ashcombe's solicitors, 3 men at a firm in Gray's Inn, who had managed the Ashcombe estate's legal affairs for 22 years. Isabel's father, Viscount Marwood, had engaged Mr. Pemberton of Lincoln's Inn to negotiate on her behalf. And Mr. Pemberton was a careful man. The document that resulted was 40 pages long. Isabel's father had read it. Mr. Pemberton had read it. Isabel herself had read it twice before signing, sitting at the writing table in her father's study on a Tuesday afternoon in December, with a cup of tea going cold at her elbow. She had read it with the same attention she brought to everything she did not intend to regret. Julian Ashcombe, Duke of Ashcombe, 34 years old, had signed it 4 months before the wedding without reading past page 3. Isabel had not known that on the December Tuesday. She had assumed a man who signed 40 pages had read 40 pages. She had been wrong, and the discovery of how wrong she had been was not the reason she was in this carriage, but it was the reason she had the pencil. She turned to page 9 and underlined a phrase in the 3rd clause. The lantern swayed. Outside, the countryside was invisible, flat dark on both sides, and the road drummed under the wheels in a steady, indifferent rhythm. Isabel turned to page 10. She had been married for 7 hours. The ceremony had taken place at 2 o'clock at St. George's, Hanover Square, with 300 guests, 2 bishops, and a great deal of white ribbon tied to things that did not require it. The wedding breakfast had been held in the Ashcombe ballroom, which Isabel had entered on her husband's arm and which she had left 4 hours later on her own, after speaking to her maid, retrieving her traveling case from the room that had been prepared for her at Ashcombe House, and descending to the side entrance where Mr. Finch was already waiting with the carriage. She had not announced her departure. She had not written a letter. She had taken one thing from the bridal chamber before she left, the copy of the marriage settlement that had been placed on Julian's writing table, the one bearing his signature, which he had not read. She had left her wedding ring on top of it. Then she had taken the settlement and left him the ring. And the distinction between those 2 actions was the whole of the matter. Page 12. She underlined another phrase and wrote a small notation in the margin. A question mark, a clause number, a reference to the corresponding passage on page 31. The pencil moved with the confidence of a woman who had done this before, who had spent 4 years managing Marwood Hall alone after her aunt's death, who had learned that a document read carefully was a document that could not be used against you. Page 15. Page 16. She turned to page 17 and stopped. She read the clause once. Then she read it again, more slowly, the pencil held still above the page. Then she set the pencil down in her lap and read it a third time. And this time she read every word with the particular attention of a woman confirming something she had suspected but had not yet proved. Clause 17. She picked up the pencil. She underlined the entire clause, from the first word to the last, in a single steady line. The lantern light caught the lead mark on the page and held it there, bright and definitive, as the carriage carried her north through the dark. The morning of the wedding had been cold and bright, the kind of March morning that looks warmer than it is, and the Ashcombe House dressing-room had smelled of shaving soap and cedar when the Dowager Duchess of Ashcombe entered it at 9:30. Lady Octavia Ashcombe was 62 years old, and she moved through every room in every house she had ever occupied, as though she had designed the architecture herself. She entered Julian's dressing room without knocking, which she had been doing since Julian was 8 years old. And she dismissed his valet with a gesture that sent the man sideways out the door before he had finished with the cravat. Julian stood at the glass, finishing the cravat himself. He was tall, dark-haired, and dressed well, and he looked, as he usually looked, composed in the way that men look composed when composure has been arranged for them by someone else. "Julian," the Dowager said. She did not sit down. She had a way of standing in rooms that made chairs irrelevant. "Tonight, after supper, Vanessa will be anxious. She will look for reassurance. You will give it to her." "Mother, I hardly think tonight is—" "You will say this to her," the Dowager continued, as though he had not spoken. "Precisely this. Are you listening?" Julian turned from the glass. He was listening. "She is quiet. She has accepted. Women of her rank do not make scenes on their wedding night. The arrangement continues." The Dowager paused. "Say it exactly as I have said it. Vanessa responds to precision. Her brother controls 3 borough votes you require for the canal bill, and she will need to feel certain of her position before she will ensure his cooperation. Do not improvise. You will muddle it." Julian looked at his mother for a moment. He had the expression of a man who had learned over 34 years that the expression did not matter. "You can repeat it," the Dowager said. "That is what I require." He repeated it. The words came back in his own voice, but they were not his own words, and the Dowager nodded once, with the satisfaction of a woman who had constructed something and found it sound. "Good," she said. She moved toward the door. "The ceremony is at 2. Do not be late. The bishop does not wait." She left. Julian looked at himself in the glass. He straightened the cravat his valet had already straightened, and he did not see the moment for what it was, because he had never, in 34 years, been given the means to see it. The ceremony was at 2, and it was everything 300 guests expected. And Isabel stood beside him at the altar in ivory silk and said her vows in a clear, steady voice. And Julian said his in a voice that was also steady, and neither of them was insincere. That was the particular cruelty of it. Neither of them had been insincere. The vows had been their own. It was only afterward, in the corridor outside the music room, that the borrowed sentence arrived. Isabel had been composing herself before the wedding supper. Standing in the corridor for a moment of quiet, her hand resting on the wall, her eyes closed, when she heard Julian's voice through the half-open door, she recognized the voice at once. because she had been listening to it all afternoon, learning the shape of it. The way a woman learns the sound of a voice she expects to hear for the rest of her life. He was speaking to Vanessa Arden. "She is quiet," Julian said. "She has accepted. Women of her rank do not make scenes on their wedding night. The arrangement continues." Isabel opened her eyes. She did not move for the length of 3 full breaths. She stood in the corridor with her hand against the wall, and she listened to the silence that followed the sentence. And then she turned and walked back to her room. With the particular steadiness of a woman who has just understood something she cannot ununderstand. She rang for her maid. She did not weep. She did not tremble. She told her maid to have her traveling case brought to the side entrance, and she went to the writing table, and she picked up her own copy of the settlement, the one she had brought from Marwood in her traveling case, the one she had read twice in December, and she took it with her when she left the room. In the bridal chamber, past midnight, Julian found what she had left him. The veil lay across the bed, arranged with a neatness that was itself a statement. The emerald case was closed on the dressing table. The Ashcombe emeralds, which had been placed around her neck by the dowager's lady's maid that morning, returned without a word of explanation. On the writing table, placed with equal care, was his copy of the marriage settlement, the one he had signed in December, the one he had not read past page 3. And on top of the settlement, centered with precision on the cover page, was her wedding ring. Julian stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he crossed the room and picked up the ring, and it sat in his palm, small and cold and perfectly circular. And he looked at it for a long time before he set it down and looked at the settlement beneath it. On the cover page, in pencil, in a hand he did not yet know well enough to recognize, but would learn to recognize in the weeks that followed, was a single annotation. Clause 17? Aye. He found Clause 17. He read it. He read it again. He sat down on the edge of the writing table, the settlement open in his hands, and he read the clause a 3rd time. And this time he understood it completely. 6 months from the date of the wedding, consummation not having occurred, annulment available to either party without contest. Protected property, Marwood Hall, in the Duchess of Ashcombe's sole legal name. His mother's solicitors had drafted it. They had drafted it to contain Isabel, a failsafe against a bride who might prove difficult, written into the document on the assumption that a woman of her rank would never use it, because women of her rank did not make scenes. Isabel had not made a scene. She had made a notation. 3 weeks passed, and Julian did not stay in London for all of them. He went north on the 22nd day, arriving at Marwood Hall in the mid-morning with the intention of speaking to his wife. And he was met at the front door by Mr. Harrow, the steward, who was a man of 60 with a gray beard and the manner of someone who had been given very specific instructions. "Your Grace." Mr. Harrow did not step aside from the door. "Her Grace is not receiving." "I am her husband," Julian said. "Her Grace instructs me to inform you that Mr. Pemberton of Lincoln's Inn has filed a preliminary inquiry regarding Clause 17 of the marriage settlement. Her Grace will receive your solicitor, Your Grace. She will not receive you." Julian stood on the front step of Marwood Hall and looked at Mr. Harrow. And Mr. Harrow looked back at him with the calm of a man who had served Isabel's aunt for 30 years and Isabel herself for 4, and who had been told, very clearly, what to say. "She's well?" Julian asked. "Her Grace is in excellent health," Mr. Harrow said. "Good day, Your Grace." The door closed. Julian stood on the step for a moment longer, looking at the closed door of a house that belonged, in law and in fact, to his wife. Then he walked back to his carriage, and he sat in it for the 4 hours of the return journey to London, and he thought about the sentence he was going to say to his mother. He composed it carefully. He revised it twice. He did not write it down, because writing it down would have meant relying on something outside himself. And that was precisely the habit he was trying to break. By the time the carriage reached London, he had a sentence that was his own, and he knew it was his own because no part of it had been given to him. He went directly to his mother's house. He did not send word ahead. He did not wait to be summoned. He walked through the front door and up the stairs and into the drawing room, where the dowager was sitting with her correspondence at the writing table by the window. And he closed the door behind him. She looked up. The expression on her face was not surprise. She did not permit herself surprise. But something shifted in it, a small recalibration, because Julian had never entered this room without being invited to enter it. And she knew, from the fact of his arrival, that something had changed. "Mother," Julian said. He stood in the center of the room, not approaching the writing table. "You wrote the settlement. You wrote the clause. You wrote the sentence I spoke to Vanessa. I do not yet know which sentences of my own life are mine. But I will find out, starting now. Do not advise me further on this marriage." The dowager set down her pen. She looked at her son with the steady attention of a woman who had been managing him for 34 years and was now encountering, for the first time, something she had not arranged. She did not speak. Julian turned and walked out of the room, and the door closed behind him with a quietness that was more final than any slam. Mr. Pemberton of Lincoln's Inn was a small, precise man with half-moon spectacles and the habit of tapping his forefinger on documents at the point he considered most important. He came to Marwood Hall on a Thursday in April and sat across from Isabel in the morning room, with the settlement open between them and a cup of tea cooling at his elbow. "The filing is preliminary," Mr. Pemberton said, tapping the relevant page. "It establishes your intent to invoke Clause 17 should the 6-month window expire. It does not commit you to proceeding." "I understand," Isabel said. "Marwood Hall is protected regardless of what occurs. Your aunt's bequest was written into the settlement by my office, and the Ashcombe solicitors agreed to it. That protection is not contingent on the marriage's continuation." Mr. Pemberton looked at her over his spectacles. "What I find interesting, Lady Isabel, forgive me, Your Grace, is that the Ashcombe solicitors agreed to it at all. The clause is unusually generous toward you. It anticipates a failure of the marriage in terms that benefit you considerably." "Yes," Isabel said. "I noticed." The Dowager Duchess's solicitors drafted the Ashcombe side. Mr. Pemberton said carefully, "They assumed, I believe, that no woman of your position would invoke a clause that required her to declare the marriage unconsummated in a legal proceeding." "They assumed correctly," Isabel said, "about most women." Mr. Pemberton looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his tea. "Quite so, Your Grace, quite so." A week after Mr. Pemberton's visit, a letter arrived from Lady Vanessa Arden. It was written on good paper in a clear, educated hand, and it proposed a meeting, just the two of them, as Vanessa put it. Women of sense settling a matter that men had complicated. The tone was not apologetic. It was strategic, and Isabel recognized it as such. And she sat at her writing table for exactly 4 minutes before she replied. She wrote 2 sentences. She wrote that the matter was not between them, that it was between a man and the voice he had not yet found, and that both she and Lady Arden were consequences of a sentence his mother had written. And she held no grievance against Lady Arden, and she had no interest in meeting. She signed it Ashcombe and sent it. She did not hear from Vanessa Arden again. 5 weeks after she had left Ashcombe House, on a morning when the walled garden at Marwood was cold but not bitter, with the first green pushing through the beds along the south wall, Isabel heard the sound of a carriage on the drive. She was already outside, walking the garden path in her wool cloak, and she did not go in. She waited. Julian came through the garden gate 10 minutes later, alone, without his valet, wearing a coat that had seen better days and carrying nothing in his hands. He stopped when he saw her. She did not move toward him. They stood 10 feet apart on the garden path, with the gravel between them and the south wall behind her. And the morning was very quiet. "Why have you come?" Isabel asked. "Because I have 3 sentences to say to you," Julian said. "I composed all 3 myself. I would like to say them, if you will allow it." Isabel said nothing. He took that for permission. "The first," he said. "The words I spoke to Lady Arden in the corridor on our wedding night were my mother's. She gave them to me that morning in my dressing room. She told me to say them exactly as she had said them, and I did, because I have never, in my adult life, composed a sentence about my own marriage without her guidance. I did not know that about myself until you left." Isabel looked at him steadily. "The second," Julian said. "I went to my mother's house 3 weeks ago, and I told her not to advise me on this marriage again. She is furious. I cannot predict what she will do. But the sentence I said to her was mine. I made it in the carriage on the way back from Marwood, and no one has heard it except her and now you." "The third," Isabel said. "I have read the settlement," Julian said. "All 40 pages. I read Clause 17. I read every clause my mother's solicitors drafted, and every clause Mr. Pemberton drafted. You are within your rights to invoke that clause, and I will not contest it." He paused. "I will also not stop composing sentences between now and then. You may annul a man who learned too late to speak. You will not annul a man who did not try." The garden was quiet. A bird moved in the ivy on the south wall. Isabel stood with her hands at her sides, and she looked at Julian Ashcombe, Duke of Ashcombe, 34 years old, standing on a gravel path in a worn coat, and she did not speak for a long time. "Come back in 2 weeks," she said at last. "Bring me 1 sentence about myself. Something you have learned about me since I left, composed by you, verified by no one. If the sentence is yours, you may return for a 3rd visit." She met his eyes. "If it is your mother's, the clock runs out without further conversation." Julian nodded once. 2 weeks, he said. He left through the garden gate, and Isabel stood on the path and listened to the carriage move down the drive. And she put her hands in her pockets and walked the length of the south wall twice before she went inside. He came back in exactly 2 weeks. The garden was the same, the morning slightly warmer, and Isabel was waiting by the bench near the old apple tree when Julian came through the gate. He was carrying a small card, the kind used for household correspondence, white, the size of a man's palm, and he held it in both hands as he walked toward her, and he stopped 5 feet away, which was 2 feet closer than he had stood before. "1 sentence," Isabel said. "1 sentence," Julian said. He looked at the card, and then he looked at her. "I would rather read it." "Then read it," she said. He read, "You have an annotated copy of Seneca's letters in the Marwood Library, the Latin edition, bound in brown calf. Mrs. Bell showed me the volume when I asked what you read. Your marginalia disagree with Seneca about friendship, specifically his argument that a friend is only valuable as an instrument of one's own virtue. I read your notes 3 times. I disagree with him on the same page. I did not know until I read your notes that I had ever disagreed with anything my mother had given me to read. He lowered the card. Isabel looked at him. She looked at the card in his hands. She looked at him again. She did not speak for a full minute, and Julian did not fill the silence, and the bird in the ivy moved again, and the garden held them both in its stillness. "That is a sentence," Isabel said. "It is mine," Julian said. "Come back in 2 weeks," Isabel said. She turned and walked toward the garden door, and she did not look back. But she was holding the image of his face, the particular stillness of a man who has just said something true for the first time and is waiting to find out what it costs him. And she carried it inside with her like a thing she intended to examine later, carefully, alone. 2 weeks after that, Julian arrived at the walled garden carrying the settlement. Not a copy, not a fresh document. His copy, the one she had left on the pillow, the one with her ring on top of it, the one bearing both their signatures from December. He had it under his arm when he came through the gate, and he walked directly to the bench by the apple tree where Isabel was already seated, and he sat down on the bench beside her. Not at the far end, not at arm's length, but 2 feet away, close enough that she could see the state of the document. It had been annotated, every page, in his own hand. She could see at a glance that it was not a solicitor's notation, not the precise abbreviations of a trained legal mind, but the handwriting of a man who had sat down with a document and worked through it sentence by sentence, writing in the margins what he thought and where he questioned and what he had not understood until he read it properly. The pages were marked throughout, and the cover was worn at the corners from handling. "You read it," Isabel said. "All 40 pages, Julian said. "Twice." He opened the document to the last page. Below the signatures, his and her father's, and Mr. Pemberton's and the Ashcombe solicitors. There was new text, written in Julian's hand, beginning at the foot of the page and continuing onto the inside back cover. Isabel leaned forward and read it. "I, Julian Ashcombe, having read this document for the first time on the 14th day of April in the year 1823, acknowledge that I signed 40 pages 4 months before my wedding without reading past page 3, and that my wife was protected in this marriage by clauses I did not know existed, drafted by my mother's solicitors, anticipating a failure of my voice that I did not anticipate myself. I add to this settlement, by my own hand, 1 clause she did not draft. Clause 41. No sentence about my wife, to any person, in any room, for the duration of our marriage, shall be composed by anyone other than me. Witnessed by no one. Unenforceable. Signed only. J.A. Isabel read it once. She read it a second time. She read it a third time, more slowly, her eyes moving over each line with the same methodical attention she had brought to Clause 17 in the carriage on the Great North Road. And the garden was very still. "You understand this clause is unenforceable," she said. "No court would recognize it." "I know," Julian said. "It is not for a court. It is for you." "And for you," Isabel said. "Yes," he said, "and for me." Isabel looked at the document in her lap. She looked at the pencil lying on the bench between them, her pencil, left there from the morning, and she picked it up. She turned to the last page of the settlement, to the foot of Clause 41, and she wrote beneath his signature, in her own clear hand, countersigned, I.A. She set the document down on the bench between them. She set the pencil beside it. Then she placed her hand, palm upward, on the bench, not offered, not extended toward him, simply placed, open, on the wood between them. Julian looked at her hand. He placed his hand over it, palm down, his fingers aligned with hers but not laced between them, holding without closing, the way a man holds something he does not intend to claim. His hand was warm. The garden was cold. She could feel the weight of it, the particular discipline of a man who understood, without being told, that the terms of this moment were hers. She counted to 30. Then she withdrew her hand, and he let it go without tightening. And she did not look at him, but she picked up the settlement and held it in her lap. "You have 3 months remaining on Clause 17, she said. "I know," Julian said. "Use them," she said. 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in early June, the 12th century chapel at Marwood was dressed in nothing but its own stone, and the light coming through the east window, which was plain glass and let in the morning without ceremony. Vicar Wren was 70 years old, and had baptized Isabel when she was 3 weeks old, and he stood at the altar in his vestments with the quiet authority of a man who had seen a great deal of human life, and had long since stopped being surprised by any of it. The witnesses were Mrs. Bell, who had been Isabel's lady's maid for 8 years, and who stood very straight and did not weep, and Mr. Harrow, who stood beside her with his hands folded and his gray beard perfectly trim. That was all. 4 people, and the stone, and the light. Isabel had placed the settlement on the altar before the ceremony began. She had set it there herself, open to the last page, Clause 41 visible, her countersignature beneath Julian's. She had not framed it or decorated it. It was a working document, and it sat on the altar as a working document, which was the only way she had ever known how to treat it. They exchanged their vows a second time. Julian's voice was steady, and it was his own, and Isabel knew the difference now. She had spent 6 weeks learning the difference, and she knew it the way you know a voice you have listened to carefully. Not just the sound of it, but the shape of the sentences, the places where a man pauses because he is thinking rather than because he has been told to pause. He placed the ring on her finger. She placed the ring on his. The chapel held the moment in its stone walls, and Vicar Wren said the words, and outside the east window the Marwood garden was green and still. Afterward, in the chapel porch, Vicar Wren had prepared a duplicate of Clause 41. Julian had written to him with the text a week before, on a sheet of good vellum, and Julian signed it in ink into the parish register, while the ink was still fresh on the page. Vicar Wren watched with his hands behind his back. "A most unusual clause, Your Grace," Vicar Wren said. "A most unusual marriage, Reverend," Julian said, and he set down the pen. "The best ones usually are," Vicar Wren said, with the equanimity of a man who had been saying true things for 50 years. Isabel took the pen. She signed beneath Julian's name, and the ink bloomed into the cold vellum, spreading at the edges of each letter in the way that ink does when the surface is not quite dry, softening the lines without obscuring them. She watched it settle. Then she looked up at Julian, and she lifted her face, and she chose. He kissed her slowly in the chapel porch, with the morning light coming in from the garden and the ink still wet on the page behind them. Her hand found the lapel of his coat and held it, not pulling him closer, only holding, the way she had placed her hand on the garden bench, open on the cold wood, waiting to see if he understood the terms. He had the pencil from the walled garden in his coat pocket, the one she had used to countersign Clause 41, and she could feel it pressed between them through the wool, small and hard and present. Mrs. Bell looked at the garden. Mr. Harrow looked at the garden. Vicar Wren looked at the parish register and found something in it that required his close attention. 4 months later, on an evening in October, Julian and Isabel Ashcombe entered Lady Sefton's autumn reception together, and the room knew it before they had crossed the threshold. Society had spent 6 months constructing a version of events. The bride who had abandoned her wedding night, the duke whose household had gone silent, the dowager duchess who had not been seen at any event since June. And the version society had constructed was not flattering to Isabel. Several matrons turned their shoulders as she passed. Not a cut. A reminder. The dowager was present, across the room, near the windows. She had not spoken to Julian since the drawing room in March. She stood with 2 women Isabel did not know, and she watched her son and his wife enter the room, and she did not move toward either of them. Lord Hartwell found them near the fireplace. He was 70 years old, direct in the manner of men who have been important for long enough that courtesy no longer interests them, and he addressed Julian without preamble. Ashcombe, London has been wondering about the delay of your return with your bride. I think you owe an accounting. The room, in the way that rooms do, went slightly quieter around them. Julian looked at Lord Hartwell. He did not look at Isabel, and he did not look at his mother across the room. He looked at the man in front of him, and he spoke in the voice Isabel had spent 6 months learning to recognize. Lord Hartwell, I signed a marriage settlement 4 months before my wedding without reading it. My wife read it. She found in it a clause her father had negotiated, which her solicitor enforced, protecting her from a husband who did not yet know how to be one. She has waited 6 months for me to become the man the settlement anticipated. He paused for the length of a breath. She is satisfied. Whether London is satisfied is London's concern. The room held. Isabel turned to Lord Hartwell and addressed him directly. My husband has composed every sentence he has spoken about our marriage for 6 months without assistance, she said. I consider that sufficient. The rest of London may take longer. I am not in a hurry. Lord Hartwell looked at Isabel. He looked at Julian. He looked at Isabel again, and something in his face, not quite admiration, but its practical equivalent, settled into place. Duchess, he said, and he bowed. The matrons did not turn back. Isabel did not care. Julian did not flinch. Across the room, the Dowager Duchess of Ashcombe watched her son speak to a man she had known for 40 years, in a voice she had not written and could not revise, and she did not move toward him, because she understood, with the clarity of a woman who had built a great deal and was now watching it become something she had not designed, that the movement was no longer hers to make. Winter came to Marwood, and the library fire burned low in the evenings, and the settlement, the working copy, the one with both their annotations, the one open to Clause 41, lived on the desk between them. On a Thursday night in December, Julian sat across from Isabel with a letter from his Ashcombe estate steward, writing his reply in his own hand. No secretary. Every sentence in his handwriting, composed that evening, revised twice. Isabel was annotating her Seneca, the brown calf Latin edition, and the library was quiet except for the fire and the scratch of 2 pens. Julian muttered something under his breath. Isabel looked up. You are muttering. I am composing, Julian said, without looking up from the page. It takes effort. It will take less with practice. Julian set down his pen for a moment and looked at her across the desk. Do you intend to be patient with me? For a duke who wrote Clause 41, Isabel said, returning to her Seneca. Yes, within reason. Julian picked up his pen, went back to the letter, and the fire settled in the grate. And outside the Marwood garden was dark and cold, and the library held them both in its warmth. 2 years after the chapel, a letter arrived from Vicar Wren. Isabel read it first, as she read most of the correspondence that came to Marwood, and then she carried it to Julian in the library without comment and placed it on the desk in front of him. He read it. A young woman in the neighboring parish, newly married, frightened of her husband's family. The vicar did not name her, but the circumstances were clear enough. She had heard of Clause 41 through servants' gossip. She wished to know if she might draft a similar clause of her own. Julian set the letter down. "Your clause has spread," Isabel said. "It was never mine," Julian said. "I wrote it for you." "You wrote it in your own voice," Isabel said. "That makes it yours. Other women are borrowing your voice now, Julian. That is not a small thing." He looked at the letter again. He looked at the fire. He picked up his pen. He wrote his reply in his own hand, without calling for his secretary, without consulting anyone. He wrote, "Madame, you may draft any clause your own hand composes. The value is not in the clause, it is in the composition. Ashcombe." He folded the letter and addressed it in his own writing and set it on the outgoing tray. Outside the library window, the walled garden lay under snow, the path where he had stood 10 feet from his wife and said 3 sentences that were his own. The bench where she had placed her hand palm up on the cold wood and waited to see if he understood the terms. The chapel was invisible in the dark, but it was there, with the parish register open to the page where ink had bloomed on vellum and 2 names had settled into the surface together, softening at the edges. Holding. Inside the library, Isabel blew out the lamp on her side of the desk. The fire gave enough light to see by. She stood and gathered the settlement from the desk, not to read it, simply to set it on the shelf where it lived now, between the Seneca and a volume of agricultural law that Julian had been working through since autumn. She straightened it on the shelf. Then she came back to the desk and held out her hand to Julian, and he took it. And she walked him to the door of her room and opened it, and he followed her in, and the door closed. The settlement remained on the shelf. Neither of them needed to reread it. They had written it themselves, clause by clause, sentence by sentence, in a walled garden in spring with a pencil and 30 counted seconds, and the discipline of a man learning to hold without claiming. And it had said, from the beginning, exactly what they meant, what they